Thank you, Mike. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you this evening. My subject, as you mentioned, is a village in the city. The village is Wavertree, and the city, of course, is Liverpool. Some of you may be very familiar with Wavertree, others less so. And for many people, it's just a place you pass through on the way somewhere else. And what I hope to show you this evening is that it has a lot of history and a lot of sort of visual reminders of what life must have been like 100, 200, or even more years ago. So let's start by sharing my screen. Hopefully everything will work. Right, can you all see the title slide?
Got that.
I'm talking tonight on behalf of the Wavertree Society. I've been local history secretary for many years, and I was a founder member in 1977. And when I first started giving talks on Wavertree, which was something like 45 years ago, I used to introduce them by mentioning landmarks that would mean something to people living outside the area. Obviously now, Wavertree is a name. It's a name embedded, in the vast built-up area of Liverpool. We go back 200 years to Greenwood's map of 1818. We find the same name, Wavertree, but at that time, the time when the expansion of the port of Liverpool was getting underway and having an effect on the countryside around, Wavertree was still a freestanding village. The road network on that last map is actually still recognizable today. I mean, if we can go back to that one, in fact, the road leading out to the east from Liverpool to Wavertree and then carrying on to Woolton is still recognizable today as Picton Road and Woolton Road. But Wavertree was quite important as a junction for travellers, because that was the place where you could turn off for Old Swan to the north, or Broad Green, or Chilwell, if you didn't want to carry on to Gattaca and Woolton. And that junction today is marked by the Picton clock. In the old days, it was marked by something called the Big Lamp, which was obviously a very well-known local landmark, often referred to in accounts of Wavertree before the Picton clock was erected. I'll be telling you all about the Picton clock later on, by the way. But as I say, in the 1970s, not many people were familiar. They didn't tend to walk around Wavertree. It was somewhere they were going through. And so I used to introduce it by talking about the Picton clock, the Abbey Cinema, which was still open until 1979 as a cinema, and then the pubs, because certainly my introduction to Wavertree when I first moved to Liverpool was going on pub crawls with colleagues from the office. And there was something like 15 pubs in those days down the high street. The Lamb was one. This picture was taken from the roof of the Abbey Cinema, by the way, in '79. The Abbey is no longer a pub today. Coffee House, still very much in business. And the Coffee House is probably one of the oldest pubs still trading in Wavertree. It's probably the tavern which was mentioned in one of the first Liverpool guidebooks in the 1790s, a tavern where assemblies from the town are supported. It had a ballroom and so on, and it was a very important place in Wavertree. Looking the other way, we can see that this junction was very much the heart of the old village. The triangular piece of land with the lock-up on over to the right, that is the village green. It's the only piece of registered common land in the city of Liverpool today. If we look at the Ordnance Survey map of 1851, you can see the lock-up marked right in the middle there on the triangular green. And you can see to the north, a lake, and then further north than that, a pump. This is the lock-up today. You can possibly just about make out one of our little green plaques on the wall of the building. I'll be talking about those later on. And every September, for the last 28 years, we've been opening it to the public as part of the Heritage Open Days programme. So if you want to have a look inside, you'll have your chance next September. When the lockup was first built, it looked like this. The system in those days, until 1796, was that the village constable would be responsible for looking after petty criminals in his own house. Most of these people were drunks, and it was just a question of keeping them till they could sober up and be let go in the morning. Sometimes it was a bit more serious. There is a record from 1793 of the constable claiming 2 shillings for looking after a man who shot a man. So some things never change. In the end, they decided it would be cheaper to build a purpose-built lockup. In fact, there were 2 cells here, one above the other, 2-story building originally. And this is how it looked until 1869. After 1869, it had the pointed roof that we're so familiar with today. But again, I'll talk about that a bit later on. In the distance, you can see a house, and that was called Lake House. No longer there, but just alongside it, in fact, within the grounds of the house was a spring, a natural spring. And this is probably the reason for Wavertree's existence as a settlement. It's a spring was bubbling out from the sandstone of Olive Mount, and it would feed the lake alongside, and also the well. This is the monk's well as we know it today. The Latin inscription has been translated as "He who here does naught bestow, the devil laughs at him below." And there are all sorts of stories, the most common of which was that there was some sort of monastery here, and if you didn't donate money when drawing water from the well, then you'd be in trouble in the afterlife. That was the theory anyway. It was mentioned in the very first guidebook to Liverpool in the 1790s. I have to say, there is no evidence of any monastery nearby, but in Victorian times, other legends developed. It said that there were long secret passageways, tunnels leading to various places, the most common of which were Chilwell Abbey or Chilwell Priory. Well, neither of those places actually had monks, and I think it's a bit unlikely that there would be a tunnel all the way from Wavertree. My theory is that there were 2 tunnels, one of which took the water from the original spring further back from the road into the well, and the other one would have taken the water, the overflow, into the lake alongside. This is what the monk's well apparently looked like in the 18th century. It was an open basin or cistern, stone tank, with, as you can see, an open archway. People would draw water by going down a couple of steps and then scooping it up. It was only in the 1830s that a pump was installed and the water was drawn from underneath. Of course, later on, with pipe water being introduced, the well became redundant. Now, I've mentioned several times now a lake. The lake was between the monk's well and the lockup. It's now the site of a children's playground, if you're familiar with the area, along Mill Lane. This was an Edwardian postcard, and this is a photograph that our society was loaned many years ago by local residents. And on the back of this one was written, the last summer of Wavertree Lake, 1928. Because in that year, the council decided to fill the lake in. They decided it was a danger to children. Many of new families were moving into the council estate that was being built higher up Mill Lane. So they decided, bearing in mind they wanted to widen the road to take trams between Wavertree and Old Swan, this was the time to get rid of the lake altogether. So nowadays, about the only reminder of the fact there was a lake there is the name of the road, which runs from the Picton Clock towards Mill Lane. So the lake itself was, as you can see, where the children's swing park is on the left-hand side. This is an extract from the Wavertree Enclosure Act of 1768. And in the top left-hand corner, you can see the lake marked. The lockup wasn't there in those days. It was only built in the 1790s, but there was an open area left, which is why it's common land today, because that was all that was left of the very large area known as the Wavertree Commons or Waste Ground. And that was the area extending all the way from the present-day Picton Clock to the present-day Queen's Drive. Queen's Drive was the historic boundary between Wavertree Township and Chilwell. So the whole of that area had been open, unfenced, as I say, wasteland until the Enclosure Act came along in the 1760s. One of the provisions of the Enclosure Act concerned Wavertree Mill. Now, if you look sort of towards the right-hand edge of this map, there's a cross with a dash circle around it. That is actually meant to represent the windmill. And there were various provisions in the Enclosure Act to protect the windmill and to keep it open to the wind from all directions. This is the approach to that windmill site from Walton Road. I was going to say it's the approach nowadays. When I checked, I found this picture was actually taken in 2009. So I think a lot of the pictures I regard as present day have become historic in many ways. But if you go back to the late 19th century, we have postcards of the same view. And as you can see, there was this post mill at the far end. In the 1980s, sadly, the site of the mill was obliterated by a pair of semi-detached houses. Our society objected to the proposal, but we were overruled. In fact, the planning officer even said that their map showed that the windmill had been somewhere else entirely. But they did, as a concession, allow an archaeological dig, and this was what the archaeologists found on precisely the spot that we had predicted. And some of those stones and bricks have been incorporated in the front garden of one of the new houses in Beverley Road. The windmill stood between two quarries, which provided much of the stone for the walls. The Enclosure Act allowed the common land to be divided up into fields, so it become more productive. And the fields were separated by sandstone walls, 4'6" high. You're probably familiar with these because the same thing happened over most of what is today South Liverpool. And much of the stone would have come from the township quarry, and the lockup was probably made from the stone here. The quarries are nowadays occupied by semi-detached houses, Mendip Road and Torview Road, which were built on top of household refuse dumped there in the 1920s and 30s. There were many legends, well, not legends, but we've managed to establish they were fact. One story about the mill was that on one occasion a 10-year-old boy was killed by the turning of the sails. On another occasion, the daughter of the miller was scalped. In the accounts at the time, it was said she was rendered insensible for 12 hours, but happily she recovered. Nevertheless, it was felt to be cursed. Another problem with the mill was the growth of trees around it. This was specifically ruled out under the Enclosure Act, but a Colonel James Bourne, who lived at Heathfield House alongside, and that is this next picture, he ignored the restriction, and in the end he was forced to lease the mill himself so that he could carry on with his trees. Now, the Bourne family, Heathfield House is long gone. It's only remembered today by the name Heathfield Road. The Bourne family are commemorated in Holy Trinity Church, both inside and outside in the graveyard. Holy Trinity Church is one of those buildings that is often open for Heritage Open Day in September. And if you get a chance, you know, it's a very, very worthwhile visit. Holy Trinity Church was built in 1794, and that's a significant date because that was the time when people started moving into Wavertree from elsewhere. In particular, wealthy business people, ship owners, merchants and so on started to move into the countryside out of Liverpool, and Wavertree was one of the villages they chose to live in. This map of 1836, this is part of Beniston's map of Liverpool. This will show this road running on the left-hand side. The map is actually looking east rather than the traditional having north at the top. East is at the top. The present-day High Street is running from top to bottom on the left-hand side, and two roads leading out of the High Street, one called Cow Lane on this map, and the other one was Church Lane, leading to Holy Trinity Church. Both of those were becoming attractive to these new middle-class residents who were building houses with extensive gardens, which is indicated on the map. This was Cow Lane. Nowadays it's called Prince Alfred Road, and we're looking here from the end of Hunter's Lane towards the High Street. And on the left-hand side of this picture used to stand a large mansion called the Grange, or Wavertree Grange. This is the only picture we have of it. This was the original was only about 2 inches wide. It was a pen drawing in of the programme of a fair that was held in 1910, and it was sort of there were a series of sketches of old Wavertree building. It's just a pity that no one seems to have a photograph of what this this building really looked like. It was originally the home of a merchant called Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence was a member of the slave-owning family Lawrence of Jamaica. There is a family tree online which actually includes him saying Henry Lawrence of Wavertree, formerly of Jamaica. And this, of course, was not uncommon in those days, and many of the large houses of Wavertree have a similar heritage. In 1866, it had become the home of Liverpool's Member of Parliament. He was a man called Samuel Graves, and he was an Irishman. He was a ship owner, and he was fortunate enough to be chosen to host the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke of Edinburgh was Prince Alfred. He was Queen Victoria's second son. And in 1866, he came to Liverpool to carry out various duties. He laid the foundation stone for the Myrtle Street Children's Hospital, and he also opened a dock in Birkenhead, which became known as Alfred Dock. Well, Samuel Graves, being one of the wealthiest men in Liverpool, must have been a bit embarrassed to always have to give his address as Cow Lane, Wavertree. So he suggested that the road perhaps should be renamed in honour of the royal visitor, and that's why today we have Prince Alfred Road. The people of Wavertree were felt very honoured. They turned out and they put this arch across the High Street. Now, when I first saw this picture, I was trying to work out where it was, and then I saw the left-hand side, the building on the edge there, and it was actually across the High Street, just at the end of Sandown Lane. And this just been on Google Maps to see the same view today. It's a picture I wasn't able to take myself because it's a bit dangerous standing in the middle of the road. But thanks to Google, their car drives up and down every road in the world, as far as I can make out, and regularly posts these pictures. So that building, if we go back to the arch, you can see the building on the left corner of Sandown Lane. Its actually address is number 1 High Street, and that's where Prince Alfred arrived in 1866. Prince Alfred Road, this is a map of 1905, and Prince Alfred Road is running here from top to bottom, north to south on the left-hand side, and Church Road by that time had got tram lines, and you can see a row of quite large houses fronting on facing across the road, Wavertree Green, and that was an area which, according to the Enclosure Act, was to be left undeveloped forevermore, mainly to allow the free passage of wind to the windmill, which was just off the map at the bottom. And you can see one of the buildings marked is the School for Blind Children. Well, that's still the Royal School for the Blind in Church Road North, but it was built on the site of another of these large houses, and it was originally called Hamilton Hall, later renamed Wavertree Hall. And there's the only photograph I've seen of it. Wavertree Hall was the home of a number of wealthy merchants, business people, none of them famous in any sense other than very local. Wavertree Hall's claim to fame is its gates. This is a photograph taken from inside the grounds when it was still Wavertree Hall. This is the same view nowadays, looking from the other side. One of our green plaques again on the left-hand side. They look like gates, but they're not. They are actually fixed railings which cannot be opened. And this is a reference to the legend that they are never to be opened. It's said that in the middle of the 19th century, the daughter of the house eloped in the middle of the night with a coachman, and this is how they left, through the gates. And her father felt she brought such shame on the family, he ordered that those gates were never to be opened again. This is commemorated on our plaque. It is said that the deeds of the School for the Blind include a restriction saying that those gates are never to be opened. Well, I've actually studied the deeds of the School for the Blind, and I have to tell you, there is no mention whatsoever of the gates. But you know, it's a good story, so we like to perpetuate the legend. So one version of the story says it has an unhappy ending. The couple, unfortunately, the carriage overturned when they got to Wavertree Lake, and they both drowned. The other story is that they managed to make it to Ireland, which is where the coachman was originally from, and they lived happily ever after and had a large family. So take a pick, whichever story you prefer. So the north of the village is another house which survived a bit longer than Wavertree Hall. Wavertree Hall was demolished in 1898 to make way for the School for the Blind. This is Sandown Hall, which survived to the end of the 20th century. Sandown Hall was the home of the Hornby family, nothing to do with Hornby trains, which were actually made very close by in Binns Road, but Sandown Hall was the home of a man called Hugh Hornby. He was mayor of Liverpool at the time. He was a merchant trading, specialising in trade with Russia. Sadly, the building deteriorated during the 20th century. Our society fought 2 public inquiries to try and save it. It was a listed building. This was the building at the time of the second public inquiry, and sadly the inspector concluded that it was too far gone. And there's me looking stern and miserable in the Echo in October 2000, bemoaning the fact that Sandown Hall had disappeared. A bit further across, just northeast of the village, was another mansion. This one still does exist, although the buildings in the background have all disappeared. This was a house called Olive Mount. This had a succession of owners during the 19th century. It was built in the 1790s for a man called James Swan, who was a grocer and tea dealer in Liverpool. And his business was in Red Cross Street, where the law courts are today, down by Derby Square. But in the 1790s, he was wealthy enough to buy this area of land in Wavertree and commission the building of this house. Well, there are a number of owners after that, but one of the most prominent was a man called Luke Thomas Crossley. I was reading in the paper on Sunday about a family that had just decided to pay reparations to the island of Grenada because their family was involved in the slave trade. Well, I knew that I remember reading that Luke Thomas Crossley had received a slave compensation payment, and sure enough, the figure was there. In 1833, Luke Thomas Crossley, he was the owner of a Leeds woolen mill, but his home was here in Wavertree. He bought Olive Mount, I suspect, using the proceeds of this award. He was awarded £12,000 to compensate him for the loss of his 670 slaves in Jamaica. And apparently this sum was equivalent to £9 million today. So that gives you some idea of the sort of people, who were around in those days in Liverpool and could afford to invest in property like this. As I mentioned, the building is still standing. This picture was taken quite a few years ago. The buildings, the red brick buildings I showed before, were the Olive Mount Children's Hospital, originally called the Wavertree Cottage Homes, which was in effect a children's branch of the Liverpool Workhouse. But by the early 20th century, the hospital had closed down, the buildings had been demolished, but the mansion, which is a listed building, had been left as offices for the Merseycare NHS Trust. Sadly, it's empty now and it's looking for a new owner. This area was once part of the grounds of Olive Mount, and it's the only green area of the Olive Mount estate still surviving. These, until recently, were the man-web playing fields, and one of the campaigns that our society has been involved in for many years now, well, it's 12 years since the lease was acquired. The sports club was closed down, and we're still fighting to keep it as green space. But this was part of the grounds of Olive Mount. And another relic of the Olive Mount mansion is the boundary wall on Chilwell Road, which is famous for its horseshoes. There are two of these stones right in the middle of this slide. You might just be able to make out a sandstone block carved with 4 horseshoes. There are all sorts of stories about how these came to be here. One is that this is the spot where the horse thieves were hanged. Another one is, which I was only told, having published a book setting out a few of these legends. This man said, oh no, that's a load of rubbish. It's where Dick Turpin jumped over the wall on his horse. Well, if you're not happy with either of those two stories, you might settle for the one that I prefer, which is these are relics of the old smithy that used to stand on Wavertree Green, which had to be demolished under the terms of the Wavertree Enclosure Act. If we now go to the High Street, you can still make out what it must have looked like in the early 19th century. This is a rather old slide. This is one that I must have taken in the late 1970s. But that bow window is still there. It's the only, we claim anyway, it's the only surviving Georgian shop front in Liverpool. Nowadays it's a wood turner's, quite appropriately. And another building still in residential use on the High Street is Rose Cottage. This is alongside the Rose Garden, which our society laid out in 1979 on the site of cottages which had been demolished many years earlier under slum clearance powers. So Rose Cottage, you only notice it's there if you walk up and down the High Street. You would hardly notice it if you go past in a car or on a bus. One of the most famous residents in her day of Wavertree High Street was this lady. She is Felicia Hemans. She was the most famous poetess in the country at the time, and nowadays, sadly, she's only remembered, I think in this country at least, for one line of one poem. And you probably all know The boy stood on the burning deck. That was a poem called Casabianca, and that was written by Felicia Hemans. She was born in Liverpool, moved out to North Wales, then she came back to live in Wavertree around 1830. She lived in a house, it's often described as a cottage, but it looks quite a grand house to me. It was the left-hand one on this postcard, number 17 High Street in Wavertree. But she didn't like Wavertree at all because the villagers were so nosy. They kept sort of apparently walking up her garden path and peering in through the windows to see how a famous poetess spent her time. And American sailors, apparently, even years after she moved away from Wavertree, used to insist on visiting Wavertree and breaking twigs off the trees in her front garden. I mean, it was almost like a Beatles pilgrimage today. That's the site of the house where she lived. The row of 3 houses now occupied by the used car centre. One interesting feature of this slide, I think, is if you look on the left-hand side where you see the word Wavertree, that building was originally set back from the road, and it would have had a garden in front of it in the days when it was a house. But when these high street houses were turned into shops, the shop front was simply extended across what had been the front garden. The business people were tending to move away from the high street into quieter, less polluted areas. Here's one of the new streets that was laid out in the 1840s. This is Orford Street, probably the most attractive street in the Wavertree Village conservation area. And this was laid out by a man called Dr. Kenyon, who lived in one of those houses next door to Mrs. Hemans' house. His father-in-law was William Orford's of Everton, a Liverpool merchant, and he named the street after Mr. Orford. If we look at the census records for the 19th century, we can see that the sort of people who lived in Orford Street were gardeners, coachmen, joiners, artists, all sort of people who would have been earning their livelihood by working for the wealthier people, either in the big mansions, which I've mentioned already, or some of the villas, the larger detached and semi-detached houses, which I'll be coming on to now. Because further north from Orford Street, a bit further away from the High Street, is Victoria Park. There were 2 of these residential parks developed in Wavertree. There was Sandown Park at the far end of Sandown Lane, Victoria Park in between Sandown Lane and Mill Lane. And they're still very pleasant areas. Every house had to be either detached or semi-detached. And the benefit for the people who lived there was that they had all the benefits of a private estate, very quiet, very, very leafy, but they didn't have the expense of having to employ their own lodge keeper. There were lodges at the entrances, and they were paid for communally. They were people such as bankers, brokers. Some of them were shopkeepers locally who'd moved into these houses from Wavertree High Street, and academics. There were a couple of professors. If you look at the street directories and the census records, it's quite interesting to see. There was quite a turnover. These houses were often rented rather than owned outright. And really, looking at the people living there, you get a real flavour for the history of Liverpool, the sorts of ways in which people were earning money. One of the houses is called Urn Mount in North Drive, Victoria Park. If you look at the wall on the left-hand side of this picture, you can see what it's meant to represent, one of these urns. These Bronze Age burial urns were unearthed in 1867 when the foundations of that house were being dug. Nowadays, they're in pride of place in the Museum of Liverpool. They were in storage, of course, for a few years when the museum was moving from William Brown Street, but now I was pleased to see when I went along a couple of months ago, they are back on show, and they date from 1600 BC, in between those 2 dates, in other words. And the plaque in the museum explains but these are among the oldest human remains ever found in the Merseyside area. So they're an indication that Wavertree was regarded as a good place to live and to die in, you know, even 3,000 years before the Monk's Well was opened up. Back on the high street, I mentioned about the shops fronts being extended over gardens. Some of the houses being demolished, replaced by new blocks of shops. There was infilling going on as well. In this case, a passageway alongside the Cock and Bottle pub was filled in by building this little house. A popular subject with Edwardian postcards with the caption, "The smallest house in England." It was just 6 feet across and 14 feet deep. And there are all sorts of stories about how many children were raised in this cottage. Physically, it's still there from the outside. It was part of the Cock and Bottle pub for many years. Nowadays, it's the entrance to the upstairs part, which is residential accommodation. If you compare the two pictures, you will notice a subtle difference, because that was what it looked like originally. See, the door was on the left-hand side and the window was on the right. When the more recent conversion took place, we were horrified to discover that the door had been moved, but we managed to persuade the new owners to at least make it look the same as it had done in the old postcard. It's not a listed building, but it is within the conservation area, and it does have one of our green plaques on it to remind people that this was called the smallest house in England. England, no, not England and Wales, because the one in Conway is very slightly smaller. Well, that plaque is actually studied and photographed virtually every day by visitors on the Magical Mystery Tour, because this is the place where they are dropped off before going to visit another of these infill developments just off the high street. And that is Arnold Grove, which was the birthplace exactly 80 years ago on the 25th of February 1943 of George Harrison. This picture, I was a Beatles guide in the early 1980s, and this is one of the very first tours we did, but now there's something like 7 tours, coach tours, every single day visiting this part of Wavertree. This map from 1905 gives you an idea of how densely developed the High Street area had become. I mentioned Arnold Grove, which is the top right northeast corner of this picture, and if you look south of the High Street, you'll see names: Hills Place, Chapel Yard, and so on, Anderton Square. These were all courts, very small properties sharing a pump, very few facilities. And here's a photograph, one of the few photographs we have, but this is Hills Place. A picture was taken in 1934 by the city engineer, just a year before the houses were demolished under slum clearance powers. But it was places like this that led to the setting up of a local board of health. The Public Health Act of 1848 had been passed by the government because there was a fear of a cholera epidemic reaching this country from Europe. And under the Public Health Act, local areas were allowed to set up their own local boards, and Wavertree was one of the first areas to do this. The local board was founded in 1850. It's one of its founder members and its chairman for many years was this man. His name was James Allenson Picton, and he was an architect, he was a historian, and he was particularly well known in Liverpool in connection with public libraries, because not only was he a member of the Wavertree local board, but he was a member of the Liverpool Town Council, and for nearly 40 years he was its chairman, which is why nowadays we have the Picton Library. But in Wavertree he was best known for other things. This is Sandy Knowe, house on the top of Mill Lane, where Picton lived. He designed it himself. As I say, he was an architect. And the man in the picture is actually a man called David Picton, who I had the honour of showing round Wavertree and Liverpool about 7 years ago. He is actually the great-great-grandson of Sir James Picton. And when we visited the Picton Library, it was quite uncanny. He stood alongside the bust of James Picton, and his wife immediately said, "He looks just like you." This is the structure he's best known for in Wavertree, the Picton Clock Tower. And this was unveiled, or probably the term is set going. The clock was set going in 1884. It was a memorial to Picton's wife. She was called Sarah Pooley, and they'd been married for 50 years. 50 years of happy marriage, he described it. And I can see why he was happy, because every summer he used to go off on a tour of Europe, sketching old buildings and so on. And he sent a stream of postcards back to his wife in Mill Lane, saying what a wonderful time he was having. So Sheila was looking after the children back in Wavertree when he was gallivanting around Europe. So he thought she deserved a clock tower, and he also wanted to create something that would be a benefit to the people of his adopted village of Wavertree. Very few people, of course, had their own watches or clocks in those days. And again, we put up a green plaque on the base of the clock, Sir James Picton, because in 1881 he'd been knighted by Queen Victoria for services to literature and art, interestingly. And I think that's a reference to his public library activities, and also the writing of his book, The Memorials of Liverpool, which is still a very useful resource for anyone interested in the history of the city. Well, I mentioned the local Board of Health. Wavertree was not just the village, because the local Board of Health covered the whole township, and this boundary map indicates the area covered. The boundary extended from, the township extended from Binns Road to what's now Queen's Drive, which is at the top of this map. It was called Priory Road in those days. Then it extended down Gypsy Lane and Rose Lane. So Mossley Hill was actually part of the township of Wavertree. And then it followed Penny Lane and Smithdown Road, more or less, as far as Webster Road. And then it continued across what became Wavertree Park to back to Binns Road. So it was quite an extensive area, and the township local Board of Health was responsible for things like drainage, paving, street lighting throughout this area. The headquarters of the local board was this building, purpose-built town hall in the High Street, and they started meeting here in 1873. It's at the time our society was founded, just over 100 years later, it was in a very sorry state. In fact, in 1978, the City Council as owners were proposing to spend £120,000 demolishing the building. But fortunately for us, a man called Eric Rook, businessman living locally, came along. He had the bright idea of turning it into a pub. Now, we take it for granted nowadays that any old banks and so on become pubs, but it was quite unusual in those days. He saw the potential, and he spent a lot of money on it, brought it back into use. It's still in use, and it's now reopened. It's gone through a few changes of ownership since, but it's now a very well-regarded cocktail bar and restaurant on the High Street. Above the entrance, the symbol of the local Board of Health and the motto Sub Umbra Floresco, I flourish in the shade. And my theory is that was Little Wavertree, the township, proud of its independence from Big Brother Liverpool, just 2 miles down the road. The emblem was apparently designed by James Picton. It was a bit tongue-in-cheek because he always felt that the name Wavertree was nothing to do with the obvious landmark tree, or a wavering tree, as some people claimed. He thought it meant a clearing in a wood. The other theory, which I've come across, which I tend to prefer, is the place by the common pond, and that does seem to be quite logical in view of what I said about the Monk's Well having tapped a natural spring, the lake alongside, and this water supply was probably the main reason why people settled in Wavertree in the first place. Anyway, Wavertree was proud of its independence, but of course it never was truly independent of Liverpool. I've already talked about the people who moved in, business people, nearly all of whom were associated with the port in one way or another, or the industries associated with it. Businesses like insurance, banking, which had developed as the trade of Liverpool expanded. And physically, Wavertree was also being swallowed up by the city of Liverpool. This is the Ordnance Survey map as revised around 1891. Picton Road is at the top of the map, running from west to east, and Smithdown Road down at the bottom. And so the area there was rapidly being covered with parallel streets of terraced houses, the so-called bylaw housing, because it was laid out under the building bylaws, which specified a minimum distance between houses, minimum widths of streets, and so on, which the builders tended to interpret as the standard. This is the same area in 1905. So you'll see that Wavertree, the right-hand end, was where the village began, had almost, but not quite, been overrun by the expansion of Liverpool. This was the traditional entrance to the village from Liverpool, the Wellington pub on the corner of Wellington Road, the Rose Brewery, no doubt catering for some of the 15 or so pubs that developed in the village during the 19th century. A gap that was left at that time, 1905, between the brewery and the rest of the village was soon filled by the City Council, Liverpool Corporation, who built one of their district libraries and the swimming baths. This picture on the left is what used to stand on the site of the baths, Thomas Davis's nursery gardens, which were very extensive. And this picture on the right is one I took a few years back. These people were direct descendants of John Davis, or De Besse as he was originally known, who set up the nursery gardens in the early 19th century on this site. He was John De Besse when he moved to Wavertree. Unfortunately, he was recruited by the press gang. This is the story I was given by the family when they came to visit. He was taken away to join the Navy, but he jumped ship, came back to Wavertree, but decided he better change his name to John Davis, pretended he was Welsh and hoped he would escape the clutches of the press gang. And he managed to survive, and the business did very well until being taken over when the nursery gardens were acquired by the council in the early 20th century. Well, I said that Wavertree was almost overrun by Liverpool. One reason why it survived was the creation of Wavertree Playground. This area of land, 108 acres, including the former Wavertree Grange estate, the one I mentioned before, that was the home of Samuel Graves, and before that a man called Henry Lawrence. Because in 1895 the house was demolished. It was suddenly announced that the whole area had been acquired by an individual who was presenting it to the Liverpool Corporation. Of course, that was the year they took over Wavertree, and it was to be used as a children's playground. The idea was it was not going to be a formal park. It wasn't going to be like Sefton Park or Prince's Park or Newsham Park, where there would be promenades for the wealthy to while away their time. It was to be used for healthy recreation for young people, because the houses that were being built at that time didn't have gardens. There was very little open space. So this anonymous individual decided that they needed somewhere to play. And Wavertree Playground was the result. That was the official name, but the reality is that it's nearly always referred to as the Mystery, because the donor was anonymous. The Daily Post almost immediately suggested it was a man called Philip Holt, who was a ship owner who lived on himself on the edge of Sefton Park. He never denied it, so we can assume, I think, that it was him. But even today, it's called a mystery. But the mystery among children of nowadays is why it's called a mystery, rather than why who the owner was, the donor was, who gave it to the city. Another thing that happened in the early 20th century was the Bluecoat School that moved out of its original site in School Lane in central Liverpool to the countryside, Church Road in Wavertree. This was a postcard at the time. In 1906 it moved in, I should say, to Wavertree. And the chapel is still there. They're magnificent buildings, and again they're usually open to the public as part of Heritage Open Days in September. This was quite a few years ago now, the chapel and the boardroom. The boardroom is now been taken over as a sixth form study centre, but as far as I know, the paintings are still there, including the picture of Brian Blundell, which has become a bit controversial, because Brian Blundell, the founder of the original Bluecoat School, it turns out was a slave trader, and there's been a lot of discussion as to whether it's quite right to make him such a prominent feature of the school. Right, well, we're almost at the end of the story now, because we're getting towards the outbreak of the First World War. This is a road called Sunningdale Road, just off Rathbone Road in Wavertree. 1910 it was built. And this is Nook Rise, also built in 1910 in what's called Wavertree Garden Suburb. Now, Wavertree Garden Suburb is another story entirely. It was part of the township of Wavertree, but its history was quite different. It was one of about 15 so-called co-partnership estates established on the edge of cities around the country, and they were trying to demonstrate the benefits and the possibilities of providing housing with gardens for ordinary working people. And the results of experiments like this, and also the First World War, where the troops were found to be extremely unhealthy, was Lloyd George's so-called Homes Fit for Heroes program in the 1920s. This was the view from Wavertree, across Wavertree Green. Church Road is on the right-hand side, and you can just about make out the windmill on the left and the Tower of Holy Trinity Church on the right. And that's more or less the same view, at least I won't say today, it was a few years ago, another of these pictures from the roof of the Abbey Cinema. But the semi-detached houses, which you can see in the road in the middle distance, that road is called Wavertree Green, and the cinema and those houses were the result of a court case in the 1930s where a judge overruled the Enclosure Act, which said that nothing was ever to be built on this area of land. The judge ruled quite sensibly that as the mill had been demolished in 1916, there was no reason why houses or a cinema shouldn't be built, because there was no windmill to have its sails turned by the wind. So these houses were typical, and the grass verges and so on were typical of the pattern of development beyond Wavertree across the rest of South Liverpool from the 1930s onwards. Well, that's the end of the story, really. As I say, Wavertree is a fascinating area in my view. It has the advantage of having been right on the edge of Liverpool around the time that town planning laws started to come in. So there's probably more left of it than if it had been closer into the centre. And our society was set up in 1977 to try and preserve the character of the area. We were unsuccessful in saving the grounds of Sandown Hall. That was our one reason it was set up. But our other two primary objectives were successful. The first one was the establishment of Wavertree Village as a conservation area. That was done in 1979, which means that the Society's area now includes two conservation areas. That's Wavertree Garden Suburb, which had already been a conservation area since the early 70s. The new conservation area we helped establish was the village, which I've been talking about tonight. We've also, what else have we been doing over the last 40 odd years? We've now put up 13 plaques. These were the first 9. We've published 2 books. The one on the left is now out of print, but you can still pick up copies quite easily on ABE Books or eBay or Amazon Marketplace. The one on the right is still available. That contains 200 archive pictures of Wavertree, some of which I've shown this evening. We've also got a website which chronicles in detail everything we've been doing since it was established, since the website was established in 1999. And as our publicity leaflet says, we have aimed to foster a new sense of community and pride in the area. Now, whether we've achieved that aim is not for me to say. 2 current issues we're very much involved in. First one is the future of the former Abbey Cinema. The Abbey Cinema was a cinema for 40 years and a supermarket for 40 years. Not that long ago, Lidl acquired it from the Co-op under the impression that they would be allowed to demolish it and build one of their standard stores on the site. But a campaign was launched. It was designated as a listed building, and Lidl have now been forced to come up with proposals for creating their supermarket within the shell. Whether it will happen remains to be seen, but this is the drawing they've recently submitted as part of their planning application. Another problem which we've been grappling with ever since the society was formed is what to do about traffic in the high street, because, as I said right at the beginning, many people regard Wavertree as just somewhere to pass through rather than somewhere to walk around. In fact, it can be quite unpleasant to walk around because of the traffic pollution and so on. This is an image from a report produced by 2 local residents, which our society is supporting. The council has recently been allocated £4 million to do something with the High Street and Picton Road, and we are very much hoping that it will be used to implement at least some of these proposals. So that's the end. I don't know whether I've overrun. Hopefully I've just about made it within the hour I was given. All I can say is if you want to know more, then have a look at our website. And if you want to do more, or if you very much want to support our aims, then please consider joining the Wavertree Society. Thanks very much for your attention anyway, and I hope you've enjoyed this walk around our village. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was a very, very interesting presentation without a shadow of doubt. And congratulations to the Wavertree Society for what you've achieved. I think that's something that we're working hard at to reserve at the tunnels. You know, I travelled through Wavertree quite a lot, but I didn't realise until tonight just how much history I'm sort of travelling through. And thanks very much for bringing us up to date with, you know, what it was like in Wavertree going back hundreds of years and what you're hoping to achieve in the future. So would everybody like to join me before we load him with questions and saying, thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.